Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first time doing a Zoom presentation like this, so I'm used to doing presentations live with people and getting feedback and interacting with the audience. So I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. Um, it's a very cool 49 degrees down here in Lake Placid, for Florida. Pretty cold for down here. Out in the field this morning working with the scrub jays. Me and my coworkers were unprepared for how cold it was. But days like this, I know how much colder it is in Minnesota. I'm definitely happy to be in Florida. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here and start my presentation. Thanks again for having me here. I'm a really big fan of the Land of Lakes Bird Alliance. As Marion noted, I was a volunteer with the chapter and I was on the board when I lived in Minnesota. I'm active with the Audubon chapter down here in Highlands County. They're still have the name Audubon. Um, but I'm happy to be active with them here, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to present some of the conservation work I've been doing in Florida with the Florida scrub jay and the Florida grasshopper sparrow.
Hey,
And
Steven.
before,
So, I'm
yeah,
sorry to interrupt. I can
yep.
see your speaker notes and then they're
Oh,
like in front of the slide.
huh,
So I don't know
okay.
if you can make it full screen.
Yeah, give me one quick second. Um, and I will fix that. I'm just going to open it on another computer so I can see them. But this is you can see it just fine right now, right,
Yeah,
Marion?
everything's fine, but I can see like your menu bar
Okay.
at the bottom. I think you just have to. Yeah, that's perfect now. Thank you.
All right. So before I get into the heart of my presentation, I just wanted to make sure that I give recognition to all the people whose shoulders I'm standing on. The Avian Ecology Lab at Archbold Biological Station, where I work, consists of some permanent staff and seasonal interns who are hired every year to help with the work during the breeding season. In this group photo over on the left includes Sahas Barve, who's on the far left sitting down. He's the head of the lab director, and Tori Bakley, who's the lab manager beside him. And there are currently two research assistants in the lab, myself and my coworker Shayla Lynch. And Glenn Wolfenden and Reed Bowman, who are in the center of this, helped found the lab that I'm working in. And on the far right here is the 2024 Grasshopper Sparrow crew that I worked with, Mary Marine and Sierra Carmack. The different Grasshopper crews include some permanent staff like Mary Marine and seasonal staff. And without the hard work of all of these people and many more over the years, the species I'm talking about tonight would have gone extinct decades ago. And I also wouldn't have most of the information that I'm presenting tonight. The charts and maps in the slides that I have tonight come from former and current Archbold employees, and all of the bird photos are from me. So I'd like to introduce myself a little bit before getting into the birds. I grew up in South Central Florida in a small town called Sebring. My dad's grandparents moved to Sebring in the early 20th century, and I grew up in the house where my grandparents lived. Sebring is about 2 hours south of Orlando and 45 minutes west and a little north of Lake Okeechobee. And my county, Highlands County, is in the headwaters of the Everglades. So all the water in my county flows south to Lake Okeechobee, this giant lake here in the southern part of the state. And then from there, it flows down to the Everglades. I moved to Minneapolis after I graduated from Florida State University with a degree in anthropology. and I became a union and environmental organizer. I was fighting for workers' rights and to protect our environment. And these pictures show some of the protests that I helped organize. But after I had been doing this for about 20 years, I decided I wanted to try something new. And I felt increasingly drawn to do to the outdoors and to do work that kept me outside, and felt like my yearly vacations to the Boundary Waters and other wild spaces just didn't feel like enough anymore. I really wanted to have work that kept me in wilderness and kept me connected with nature. And I wasn't sure how to do that yet. I wasn't sure where to start. So I tried a lot of different things. I started birding. Some people, including my wife, might say I was birding a little obsessively. I got my Minnesota list up to 264 species before moving back down to Florida. And I lived 2 blocks from Powderhorn Park, which was my favorite birding patch in Minnesota. I also joined the board of directors of the Land of Lakes Bird Alliance. And this photo shows myself and Marion putting up a bird feeder in Powderhorn Park. And then I finally got my first conservation job working at Three Rivers Park District, which, if y'all don't know about the Park District, you should look it up. It's got some of the best birding locations in the Twin Cities metro area. But I still wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do, and the things that I was doing didn't quite scratch the itch that I was feeling. And I was feeling drawn home to Florida and to doing conservation work and to ornithology. So during this time period, I read a really striking book called "Shadow and a Song" by Mark Jerome Walters, who he also recently published a book on Florida scrub jays. And "A Shadow and a Song" is about the extinction of the dusky seaside sparrow, which is a subspecies of the seaside sparrow. And its primary habitat is actually right where my mother was born and where she grew up on the east coast of Florida near Merritt Island and Melbourne. But the dusky seaside sparrow went extinct because of human mismanagement, including some really terrible decisions by NASA. And the last dusky seaside sparrow went extinct or died in 1990 when I was 8 years old. But I had never heard of it until 2022. So all of these things led me to Archbold Biological Station. So Archbold Biological Station, where I work now, is located on the southern end of the Lake Wales Ridge. And I'm going to talk more about what that is later in the presentation. At Archbold, we have 4 main pillars: saving the rarest of the rare, sustaining grasslands, addressing climate change, and connecting large landscapes and wildlife corridors. My work at Archbold has focused on saving the rarest of the rare. Our work takes place throughout an area known as the headwaters of the Everglades. And this map shows the general area with pins. There are little red pins scattered around the map showing sites where Archbold employees do research. And the light brown on the west side of the map is the Lake Wales Ridge, and the dark red blocks down in the bottom of it are where Archbold is located. And the green areas are lands that are held in conservation. So Archbold Station is located just 40 minutes from south of my childhood home, but I didn't know about it growing up. I went to elementary school in a different county, and I missed the yearly field trip that all third graders in the county get to take to Archbold. Archbold is now organizing a new educational program to reach out to middle and high schoolers and help introduce them to the incredible science that's being done in their own backyard. And this comic is the main centerpiece of how we're going to be doing that outreach. We had an intern in the Avian Ecology Lab drew a comic book about Florida scrub jays. And the comic book is going to introduce students to basic ecology concepts like fire ecology, and also teach them about the natural world in their own backyards. So my first focal species at Archbold Station was the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, which the scientific name is Amadromus savannarum floridanus. And one of my first lessons at Archbold was how to pronounce that. The Florida grasshopper is one of the rarest of the rare of species. It's a subspecies of the grasshopper sparrow that I'm sure many of you have seen in Minnesota. And the parks that I worked at in the Three Rivers Park District actually have some of the best places to find them in the metro area in Minnesota. The Florida grasshopper sparrow has a very subtle song. It's three or four quick, high-pitched notes followed by a sharp buzz. And I like to think of it like a quiet cicada almost. So here's a video of one singing that I took at my job. And it's quiet and quick and can be easy to miss, but it's one of my favorite bird songs. I love to be out in the prairie, hearing that bird sing. The Florida grasshopper sparrow depends on a very specific ecosystem to live and breed, called Florida dry prairie. It's a grassland ecosystem, similar in many ways to Minnesota prairie. A major difference is the presence of saw palmetto, which you can see saw palmettos in this picture on the left, the slightly taller plants. And saw palmetto is a highly flammable, slow-growing plant that's characteristic of many Florida ecosystems. These plants, the saw palmettos, they're here in the foreground, and there's a taller one here. They may be thousands of years old, even though they appear to be very small. Florida dry prairie has always been a pretty rare habitat, but with colonization and subsequent development after that, the habitat has become even rarer. This map shows the distribution of the Florida grasshopper sparrow. It's very limited habitat in Central Florida. And every year, little bits of it get chipped away even more. Right now, there are less than 100 pairs of Florida grasshopper sparrows in existence. So it's on the brink of extinction. They live at four primary sites: the Avon Park Bombing Range, which is in the county where I live now, Highlands County; Three Lakes Wildlife Education Area; DeLuca Preserve, which is where I worked, and I'll be talking in more detail about it; and Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park. And we know that some pairs live on private ranches in the area, but we're not always able to access the ranches to survey them. Given how few of these birds there are left, it's really existentially in a similar position as the dusky seaside sparrow once was. But this time around, hopefully we've learned some important lessons from the extinction of the dusky seaside sparrow. And we've got a statewide team of biologists and research technicians working to save it. So one place where we're trying to save it is at DeLuca Preserve, which is where I worked this last year for 6 months. DeLuca Preserve is a working cattle ranch owned by the University of Florida and Ducks Unlimited. Archbold Biological Station is contracted to monitor and protect the grasshopper sparrows there. The preserve is maintained as a cattle ranch to study how ranches can be more eco-friendly. It's also it's a beautiful place full of small wonders and big wonders. And these photos are just a few of the really beautiful things I saw there. There's pitcher plants growing all over the place. You can see them in the upper left-hand corner, and lots of different species of grasses that you can see. There's a bottlebrush species in the bottom left, and several Lionia or blazing star species like this one in the upper right. and butterflies everywhere all the time. And then we would also see the cowboys out herding the cattle on the ranch. Ranches are some of the most extensive grasslands left in Florida, and there are so few sites left with intact Florida dry prairie that if the Florida grasshopper sparrow can't coexist with cattle on ranches, it's likely that it'll never be delisted from being endangered. So our day-to-day work with the grasshopper sparrows involve during the breeding season involves going out very early before sunrise. So we would sometimes be out at 5 a.m. And looking for grasshopper sparrows. So the males display fairly prominently, and they sing that song I played earlier. We use spotting scopes to check the bands to see which bird we're looking at. So if you, this picture of the male grasshopper sparrow, you can see his bands on his legs. And once we find a male singing, then we watch the male until we see him interact with the female, because the female grasshopper sparrows are very secretive. It's very uncommon to see one at all. They skulk on the ground a lot and don't perch up and sing typically in the same way that the males do. So we have to wait until we see the male interact with the female in order to find her. And once we found the female, we observe her behavior until she leads us to a nest. It's a really taxing process. You can spend an entire morning and never see a female. You can take a week or two, or sometimes longer, observing a pair before you can actually find their nest. It takes a lot of very patient, slow, careful observations. Um, and these are pictures of the nests at different stages of development. So this one on the left is when it's still eggs, and there's a couple birds that have hatched in the middle here. And then this is a fledgling on the far right. And I really, every time I found a nest, I was just completely filled with awe and wonder. Just seeing this entire universe contained in a little grass cup, buried under the grasses and plants. And it's the entire world to these birds. It's really very beautiful. Once we find a nest, our top priority is to put up a predator fence around it. So you, in this big picture in the middle, you can, it's a little hard to see, but there's a fence surrounding a nest. We spray paint the fences to make them, we spray paint them camouflage to make them a little bit less visible. And if you look closely at the large picture here, you'll see like yellow foam on the bottom. We use metal staples. You can see some in my hand up here in the upper left hand corner and or picture, and some of them hanging on a fence here. We use those staples to anchor the foam to the ground and the fence. And the fences keep out mammalian predators like skunks and foxes. And um, the survival rate of the nestlings goes up dramatically when we put up the fences. They found it was the survival rate increased by more than 30% by putting up the fences. And in fields with cattle, we also put up a small electric fence to keep the cows away from the nest. And you can actually, in this picture in the upper left-hand corner, you can just make out an electric, what the electric fence looks like. And if you look very carefully, you'll see a Florida grasshopper sparrow perched on top of the post for the electric fence. So once the eggs hatch, red invasive fire ants represent the biggest threat to the birds. Invasive fire ants were accidentally imported to the United States in the 1930s from South America. The first location they arrived was the port of Mobile, Alabama, and they've spread out rapidly across the entire south of the United States since. They're really fierce and vicious creatures. We don't have them in Minnesota, but if you've been to the South, you've probably run into their mounds before. This is a picture of what one of their mounds look like. And any disturbance on their mound leads thousands, maybe millions of them to swarm all over what is disturbing them and bite and sting them. And and it's very painful when they do. But the ants send out scouts to look for food, and when they find it, they swarm whatever it is, and they consume it rapidly. So if they find a nest of a ground nesting bird, like a Florida Grasshopper Sparrow or an Eastern Meadowlark, or really any ground nesting bird, they will swarm the mound and kill the nestlings and eat them. We use boiling water to kill the fire ant mound. This is a picture of me having just poured some boiling water into a fire ant mound. And it can take several times of pouring multiple gallons of boiling water onto the nest to successfully treat one. They are very resilient, invasive creatures. And it's a they're tragically killing off lots of bird species. They're really terrible. The status of the Florida grasshopper sparrows has gotten dire enough that researchers have created a captive breeding program. There are birds held at permanent aviaries in 2 locations in Florida. And once the juveniles are old enough to care for themselves, they're brought to release sites, and they're placed into a temporary aviary. And the picture on the right-hand side, you can see what the temporary aviaries look like. And they stay there overnight to acclimate to the new place where they are, and then they're released in the morning. And while I was working at Archbold last year, the program released its 1,000th bird. And this work goes on each year during the breeding season from about April to about September. So my position there was seasonal. It ended in September. And then in October, I started a new position at Archbold working with the Florida scrub jays. So the Florida scrub jay, its scientific name is Aphelocoma coriolensis, is a federally threatened species. It's doing better than the Florida grasshopper sparrow, but that's really not saying a lot. Scientists estimate that there were about 100,000 family groups of Florida scrub jays prior to colonization, and today there are about 4,000 family groups. So that's a decline of 96%. And their habitat even today is under constant threat of development. The house I live in right now in Lake Placid actually used to be Florida scrub, and within the world of ornithology, there's a somewhat famous book on the Florida scrub jays, and there's a chapter in the book studying what the scrub jays did when the neighborhood development that I'm in was started. And this development happened while I was growing up in the area. So on the previous map that I showed of Florida, some of you might have noticed a real thin line running through central Florida with my hometown Sebring down at the southern end. So this thin brown line here that's zoomed in on the right is the Lake Wales Ridge. The Lake Wales Ridge contains a unique Florida ecosystem called Florida scrub, which these 2 photos are different photos of what Florida scrub looks like. The Lake Wales Ridge is an ancient sand dune because millions of years ago, most of Florida was underwater, except for a few thin slivers of islands. Today, the ridge contains some of the highest points in Florida and a sandy soil type reminiscent of a beach. So you can actually see this white sand here. And small scrubby oaks. A lot of the plants, especially growing in the left picture, are very small oak trees. They grow there, and there's tons of unique plants and animals. Floridians call this sand sugar sand, and it's really perilous for getting vehicles stuck. Don't ask me how I know that. So this map that I pulled up on the screen shows all of the existing locations for Florida scrub. All of these are ancient relic islands, and because they're higher and drier than the surrounding areas, they're really valuable real estate. Enormous swaths of the scrub were converted to orange groves in the 20th century. Orange groves need good draining soil, and the sand drains really well. So it provided perfect habitat for orange groves. Today, though, the biggest threat is development and condominiums and strip malls. So on the Lake Wales Ridge, uh, there are an enormous amount of endangered and unique species. There's actually 46 imperiled species that live on the Lake Wales Ridge. 21 of Florida's 70 federally protected plant species live on the ridge, and there are a lot of fairly unique animals, including the Florida scrub jay, the gopher tortoise, the Florida mouse, the indigo snake, and the Florida sand skink. So from a conservation perspective, Florida scrub and the Lake Wales Ridge are very important places. So onto the Florida scrub jay. Um, the Florida scrub jay is a really interesting species for a number of reasons. And probably the one that is most prominent for people that see one is that they're really charismatic birds. So if you are out hiking or walking in an area where there are Florida scrub jays, um, they're quite likely to fly just on their own, fly up to you and start and try and investigate who you are and what you're doing there. They're really curious birds, and they are also famous for landing on people's heads, on their shoulders, or their hands, hoping for a food handout. Um, that behavior is learned behavior. If any of you have been to like Lyonia Preserve, which is a popular spot for people to get their lifer, Florida scrub jay, them landing on you is something that they learn from being fed. So it is something we discourage people from doing because we don't want them to associate people with food too strongly. But it is a thing that they're known for and famous for, and most people who live in the area have seen this bird and are at least vaguely aware of it as a bird that will fly right up to them and potentially land on them. When I was a kid growing up here, my grandfather would actually tell me about scrub jays on his farm that he fed peanuts to. They would come out and land on his head whenever he was out working on his farm. Another unique and interesting thing about Florida scrub jays is that they live in family groups of 2 to 8 jays in defined territories. So every spring at the Avian Ecology Lab, we map all the territories on Archbold Station. So this first map on the left, and I actually don't know why this map was purple. I was wondering that when I got it, but it's a zoomed out map that shows all of the Florida scrub jay territories on Archbold Station. So the black lines are the different territories. This picture on the right is zoomed in of the zoomed in version of the one on the left, and it shows territory boundaries again in black lines, and the white lines that you see here are fire lanes that also serve as roads through Archbold. And each family group, we give each family group a unique 4-letter name. So, for example, Yoha or Singh or Mali or Toom. Um, and you will see down here on the left, we call this one Wise Bud because it was a budded territory from Wise. So one of the helper birds in the Wise territory formed their own territory right next to Wise. So we called it Wise Bud. Um, Even though the jays can breed after 1 year, the young jays stay home with their parents until there's an opening in a nearby territory for them when a breeding male or female dies nearby, and they can go and try and take that spot so that they can have their own territory. During the non-breeding season, the helper jays disperse out around looking for new territories. And the females tend to disperse further, and they have higher mortality rates. So this characteristic of the Florida scrub jays, delayed breeding, is almost certainly a response to limited habitat. The jays tend to fill up all of the available habitat, so young jays have to wait their turn to get their own territory. But that's not all bad because they share 50% of their genes with their siblings, just like all of us do. So staying home and helping mom and dad raise the next generation is still a pretty good strategy for propagating their genes. And in addition, studies have found that jays who have spent a couple seasons or more helping raise their siblings are more successful breeders when they do finally get their own territory. Florida scrub jays and the scrub habitat where they live are fire dependent. This chart on the left of the screen shows the relationship between the number of family groups to time since fire. So the horizontal x-axis shows time by years going from 1983 to 2023, and the vertical y-axis shows the number of groups in an area. So fire in 1990 and 2010 are marked here on the chart. And you can see that the number of groups reaches a nadir right at each of the fires in 1990 and 2010. And then after the prescribed burns, the number of family groups steadily climbs for about 10 years and then starts declining again until there's another fire. So at Archbold, we recommend a fire rotation of about 15 years for each area. So the fires are important because they stop the spread of fast-growing tall pine trees. And the taller pine trees provide perches for raptors to predate on jays and also shade out the smaller oak trees. The scrub jays depend on acorns from the oak trees to eat in the fall and the winter. It's virtually all they eat in the fall and winter. And the taller pines also start to change the makeup of which birds are in the area. So one obvious example of that is that more blue jays will move in when there's more tall trees. And the blue jays are able to outcompete the scrub jays for breeding areas and food. So after habitat destruction, these days, as I said before, the biggest threat for habitat destruction is new development. But fire suppression is one of the top reasons for the decline of the Florida scrub jay. Because even in conserved lands, it's like lands owned by the Fish and Wildlife Commission here in Florida, which is like the DNR of in Minnesota. But even in those conserved lands, for decades, fire was suppressed. And it took a long time before fire was recognized as being an important part of scrub ecology. And land managers today recognize that fire is necessary and a really critical part of how to maintain the habitat. But there's still many reasons why fires aren't utilized enough, even on managed lands. There's sometimes human structures that are too close, or sometimes there isn't enough budget or enough staff to conduct burns. And the situation is even worse on privately run lands where landowners may be reluctant to have fires on their own privately managed land. So even in places where there is potential scrub habitat for Florida scrub jays, often the habitat is not managed well enough for the scrub jays to be able to successfully live and breed there. So during the breeding season, and that's from approximately February through September, our primary job at the Avian Ecology Lab is to find each and every nest from scrub jays on Archbold territory and color band the juveniles. So Archbold's been banding the jays for almost 50 years now, and it allows us to recognize each individual bird. You can see the bands. There's a silver band, and that band comes from the federal government. Every bird that is banded by researchers in the United States is required to put one of these federal bands on the bird. And then we also put a unique combination of color bands. So this bird also has two bands on its other leg, and no other jay has that same combination of bands. Um, and we go out every month and we do a census of every jay on Archbold property so we can see who has lived and who has died in the last month, if there have been changes to territory status, or to who the dominant breeders are in a given territory. And without having the unique color bands on each jay, we wouldn't be able to do a monthly census. And because we also go and find every nest and band the jays, we have multi-generational pedigrees for each jay that goes back to the 1970s, which is a pretty incredible data set in ecology. There's very few data sets that exist showing the pedigree of a species going back that far in time. Um, and the thing that is really amazing about having that much data is it lets us answer questions that the original researchers, which I showed at the beginning of my slide deck, Glenn Wolfenden and Reed Bowman, they were able now to answer questions that they hadn't even thought of, and for problems that they hadn't even thought of. So one obvious example, just recently, Sahas Barve, who's the lab director now, he recently published a paper showing that the Florida scrub jay nesting season is now starting earlier because of climate change. So they are breeding earlier in the year than they were when we first started monitoring the scrub jays. And without having long-term data sets like the one that we have in our lab, it would be almost impossible to track the impacts that climate change are having on different species. And that's particularly important for monitoring species like the Florida scrub jay, which is federally threatened. So this actually brings me to the end of my formal presentation. And if you want to learn more about the conservation work and the educational work that Archbold Station does, I would encourage you to visit our website, which I've got here on the screen. There are tons of articles up on our website, and if you find our YouTube page, you can find it through the website or just by Googling Archbold Station YouTube. There's some really great educational videos up there. There's a new video that came out fairly recently on the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow, looking at how the Avon Park bombing range, which is a military site, is actually become conducive for protecting Florida Grasshopper Sparrows. Thank you everyone for your time. I enjoyed being able to present some, and I excited to take some questions and maybe have a little bit of discussion about this.
Thank you. So, anyone who has a question, please enter it in the Q&A chat. We have a question from Karen. Is there another area in the US that we can relocate the scrub jay?
Uh, no, there isn't. It is the scrub jay evolved alongside the ecosystem it lives in, Florida scrub. So your question gets at the evolutionary history of the Florida scrub jay. So there are numerous other scrub jay species in the United States and in Mexico, and all of them are significantly further west than Florida. So California has a couple of scrub jay species. There's some in like Arizona and Texas, and like I said, Mexico. The scientists currently believe that in millions of years ago in ancient history, there were scrub ecosystems that had spread across all of the south of the United States, including down to Florida. And scrub jays were able to migrate as far as Florida. But as the geology shifted, Florida, all of the scrub environments in Florida became islands. Like I said, the Florida scrub jays became an isolated population from the other scrub jay species. And then over the subsequent millions of years, it co-evolved along with the ecosystem it lives in now. And it depends on the plant species that grow there, the oak species that grow there in particular, for nesting and for its food. You can see other scrub jay species, but the Florida scrub jay can only live in Florida scrub here in Florida.
That's so interesting. We have blue jays up here, and they're like the most adaptive generalist bird that you
Yeah,
can find. And so to find such a fragile specialist in the jay family, I feel
yeah,
is pretty unique. We
it
have
is really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, a follow-up about the scrub jays. I think Karen's wondering about like a hybridized program. She asks if the scrub jays in those areas ever interbreed.
Um, I well, the Florida scrub jay certainly doesn't interbreed with any other scrub jays because there are no other scrub jay species in Florida. I do not know the answer to if the other scrub jay species can interbreed and produce offspring that can also breed. I think the answer is no, but I don't know that 100% for sure.
Then there's the question, can they, which you could figure out like through the phylogenetic tree if you know that. And then there's also like, would they? Like
Yeah,
if a male and a female from each group were together, would they? And I don't, maybe those two answers are not the same.
yeah, yeah. I mean, they're all of them are different species. So for one reason or another, whether it's physiological or, as Marion said, behavioral, they don't interbreed now. So as to whether they could, I mean, potentially, but in general, they don't because for various reasons unique to each species. So
Bad mood lighting. Just kidding.
yeah.
Uh, so we have a grasshopper sparrow question about wanting to know more about the successes and challenges to the captive breeding program.
Yeah, I mean, I was not here working on with the grasshopper sparrows when the captive breeding program started. It started several years before I was working here. Um, but I've been told that it is generally seen as being very successful. But the decision to start the program was not an easy decision to make. It's a little bit fraught with peril because at the time, nobody knew if they could get the Florida grasshopper sparrows to breed and live in captivity. Not all species will breed successfully in captivity. So you can imagine like going out and capturing some of the wild birds and then bringing them into an unknown experiment is extremely risky. But the subspecies is getting so close to extinction that it was decided that that risk was worth taking. And as it turned out, the Florida grasshoppers do. They actually breed really well in captivity. They don't seem to mind at all. And it's been very successful in terms of producing lots of young. There have been different challenges in successfully in producing healthy offspring, and they've had to make some changes in the way that they do the censuses and the way that they feed the young because they were finding that especially in the earliest stages of development, too much human interaction was affecting the long-term health of the young grasshopper sparrows. So they had to adjust how often the youngest birds were exposed to humans. Um, and then, there's also just the reality that most birds don't survive in the wild. So there's like, they've released 1,000 young birds, and there's still only about 100 pairs in the wild. So, y'all can do the math. That means that most of the birds that are released aren't surviving. But it does mean that substantially more young birds are being released into the wild, period. That number of young would never have made it to the point of being able to even try to breed on their own. So in terms of releasing lots of birds, it's been really successful, and it has at a minimum maintained the population. Um, but it remains to be seen long term if the captive breeding program really is able to um, grow the population in a meaningful way, if that makes sense.
Does that have to do with the spatial requirements and the extremely limited habitat that's available? That there's um, a very small number and they have predator threats that would increase mortality, but then there's also a spatial constraint over of how many grasshopper sparrows can live, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Although there is more space right now than there are birds. So there is space for them to expand into. It just the reality is it's like a hard life to be a little sparrow out in the prairie, and there's lots of predators out there. There's most birds don't make it to breed, whether they're raised in a captive breeding program or not. So it's a hard life, is a reality. But there is space for them to expand. But um, like I said earlier, unless we're able to successfully help the grasshopper sparrows live alongside cattle ranches, it is unlikely that there'll ever be a big enough wild population for them to not be listed as federally threatened.
We have a lot of interest in this topic and the scrub ecosystem. Charlene is wondering what the oak species are that grow there.
Okay, you're gonna test my knowledge here. I'm still relatively new to the scrub, but there are four primary oak species that grow in the Florida scrub. So Quercus geminata is one of them. Some of them, like I don't think that Quercus geminata actually has a common name. It's just called geminata. And Quercus myrtifolia, which is called myrtle oak, yeah. Quercus inopina and Quercus chapmania, which is called Chapman's oak, is the common name. They Some of those species grow in other places beside scrub, but some of them don't. Um, and they're generally all pretty low growing, although if there isn't a regular fire regime, they can grow taller, but generally they're pretty low, kind of shrubby oak species. After I first learned how to identify oak species in Minnesota, and when I wish I had a picture of zoomed in leaves of some of the oak species. I did not even know that the trees I was looking at when I saw these trees were oak trees. They look so different than the oak trees in Minnesota. There's also an oak species called runner oak that grows in the Florida dry prairie, and it grows on the ground almost like a vine, but it's still a Quercus species, just like the red oaks and white oaks that grow in Minnesota.
Lisa's wondering if the grasshopper sparrow could survive in any areas outside of Florida.
Well, the grasshopper sparrow does. So grasshopper sparrows as an overall species live all over the United States and parts of Mexico. I Uh, there are a number of subspecies of grasshopper sparrows. I'm blanking on the total number of subspecies. Um, so grasshopper species as a overall, yes, can live all over, but the Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is the subspecies of the grasshopper sparrow, can only live in the Florida dry prairie, and potentially in ranch lands, but it requires grasslands in Florida. So I don't know if that answers the question because maybe the heart of what you're asking is actually a question about what a subspecies is in some ways, which is can be a complicated question, but it's essentially a subpopulation of a species that is different enough for one reason or another to be recognized as a particular group. And the Federal Endangered Species Act doesn't just protect species, it also provides equal protection to subspecies. Because subspecies are, that's the process by which speciation happens, is that subspecies are formed and then eventually may become their own species.
Interesting. So, along those lines, are the ranchers cooperative with protecting the sparrows? And are there any federal protections that would apply to their like their land management?
Yeah, I mean, some ranches are really cooperative, some aren't. There's a, wide spectrum. The some places let us on to survey, and some don't. Right now, we don't have any recommendations for what ranches can do differently in order to help Florida grasshopper sparrows. That's actually a key part of what is being done at DeLuca Preserve is trying to come up with a set of things that ranchers can do. And the overall approach that the grasshopper sparrow team is trying to take with ranches. And actually, there's been a general approach in Florida towards ranches of trying to use a carrot instead of a stick. Um, so trying to figure out incentives for ranchers um, rather than regulations. Partially, that's because there's just been so much habitat destruction in Florida of native habitats, of Florida scrub, of Florida dry prairie, of swamps, of just about every ecosystem. And in terms of a lot of the more significant uh, semi-wild areas are ranches right now. And the if the ranches go away, the most likely thing is that they're going to become developments. And so the conservationists in Florida really are trying to take an approach of figuring out how to make sure the ranches stick around because the general thinking is that it's better for land to be held as a ranch than to be a strip mall or a condominium. So we're part of kind of the long-term goals are to figure out a series of recommendations and incentive programs for things that ranchers can do to help protect the grasshopper sparrows.
Do you think the conservation easements of the American West are a good model to follow, or do you think they lack enough like compliance monitoring?
I don't know if I don't think I know anything about the conservation easements in the West, but conservation easements are one of the most important tools that people are using in Florida. So there's actually a huge um I'm trying to remember the total acreage, something like 38,000 acres. The state just announced are being put in conservation easement. And if folks don't know what that means, it just means that a landowner in Florida often means ranchers agrees to essentially sell the development rights for their land so that their land will remain a natural space in perpetuity. And essentially, like the state or some third party organization like Ducks Unlimited or maybe University of Florida owns the development rights to the land, and they're also responsible for monitoring the land to ensure that it's not being developed and that it's being managed properly. Sometimes that organization is also responsible actually directly for managing it. Um, so it seems to work pretty well down here. There's enormous swaths of land and easement, and there's a upper limit to how much more land is available to just be directly owned by the state, and how much money the state has to buy land. So easements are generally seen as a kind of like alternative to outright buying the land that's a little cheaper, but still keeps the land wild. So there's a major project in Florida that Archbold is a really core partner in called the Florida Wildlife Corridor, that is trying to create a green corridor all the way from the Everglades up through the Panhandle that, in principle, a Florida panther or a Florida black bear, which is a subspecies of the black bear, could walk all the way from the Everglades to the Panhandle, and it's not totally filled in yet. There are some pretty big spaces where there's no wild spaces connecting different areas, and a lot of the open gaps actually are here in the Central Florida where I'm working. And conservation easements have become one of the most important tools for trying to fill in the empty spaces in the wildlife corridor.
Is the conservation goal of the corridor to reduce road deaths, or is it genetic diversity, or are all of the above?
Yes and yes, yeah.
Okay.
There's road deaths for like Florida panthers are one of the biggest threats to the species, and there have been some places where they've successfully put in underpasses underneath roads where there's lots of um, mortality of panthers, and those have been pretty successful. They're actually going to be putting some in on Highway 27, which is the primary highway here in Highlands County, because Highlands County has become a major center of panther road strikes. So
Karen wants to know how the captive breeding program can keep the uh, breeding pool genetically diverse.
yeah, that's a really, really good question. And creating the captive breeding program, part of the reason it was created actually was to help maintain genetic diversity and the overall population. So the intention, kind of the intention of the program is to think about all of the Florida grasshopper sparrows as like a meta population. There are four subpopulations, the four sites that I named before. So the Avon Park Bombing Range, Kissimmee Prairie Preserve, DeLuca Preserve, and Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park are subpopulations that in principle are only breeding amongst themselves. Every now and then we see a sparrow come from one area to another, but in general, birds are limited. There's a limited pool of breeding availability. So the captive breeding program actually helps mix genes between the different sites. Um, and they periodically still capture some wild birds in order to and put them into the captive breeding program. And they have an emphasis on wild birds that are not related to any of the birds in the captive breeding program, so they can introduce an entirely new set of genes to the program. But yeah, like I said, the kind of maintaining genetic diversity was actually one of the core goals of creating the captive breeding program.
And Charlene asks if you visited other areas of Florida that have scrub jays.
Not as much as I would like. Most of the places I've visited with scrub jays have been here in Highlands County. We do monitoring work at a lot of the state-owned sites in the area. So I part of what is really great about this job for me is I've gotten to visit all these like beautiful natural areas in the place where I grew up, and that some of these places are places that like my father and my grandfather grew up playing in as children. Now I'm getting to go visit them myself. A lot of places I've never been before. Um, but there's a lot of other great places. Jonathan Dickinson State Park is kind of a famous place to see scrub jays. Further, it's on the coast, on the East Coast. And I mentioned Lionia Preserve, which is relatively close to Orlando. Merritt Island is another place that has a large population. The largest population of scrub jays is in Ocala National Forest in the center of the state. And there's a huge area. Most of the birds are unbanded, and there's not researchers out there looking at the day-to-day of those birds. I would love to go visit Ocala National Forest and see the areas where the scrub jays are there.
My aunt and godmother is in Ocala, so I
Uh-huh.
hope to go. I've been to the Weeki Wachee Hot Springs mermaid theme park, but I haven't been to the National Forest
Yeah,
yet.
yeah. My
Um,
sister lives in Ocala,
okay.
and I've been to visit her, but haven't made it to Ocala National Forest yet.
That's interesting. It's there's cattle ranching, but there's also, isn't there a lot of horse ranching in Central Florida? And is that part of the conservation efforts to include, I guess you wouldn't call it horse ranching, but horse farming?
Yeah. I don't know, actually. I
Okay.
would assume so, but I don't know. That's a good question. I
And
hadn't thought
then,
about that before, but in the Ocala area in particular, there's a lot of horse farms.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's because they have the best grass in the world
Uh-huh.
because there's a limestone substrate that creates great conditions.
Uh-huh.
So we have a fire ants question. You mentioned pouring boiling water on the fire ants near the grasshopper sparrow nests. Is there a broader effort, maybe within government agencies, to eradicate them?
Yeah. There's lots of researchers studying invasive fire ants. I From what I know, I don't think at this point it would be possible to eradicate them. They're so widespread and just so pervasive and so resilient that I, I don't know that it'll ever be possible to eradicate them. I mean, it was definitely one of the least pleasant parts of the job. I don't like killing other living beings at all. So I didn't particularly enjoy doing this, but like I recognize how necessary and important it is sometimes to have to do that to maintain an ecosystem and to save a species. But we would pour those big orange jugs hold like 5 gallons of water, and we would pour 4 or 5 of those and on an ant mound, dig up the ant mound, like get everything we could, and come back a few days later, and they had rebuilt. Um, and it's generally thought that using boiling water like that is the best method of treating them, short of using some different kind of poisons that we didn't want to use, that we actually just can't use at DeLuca Preserve. They don't use any insecticides at all there, and we wouldn't want to use them near the grasshopper sparrow nests anyway, because the grasshopper sparrows eat insects. So but yeah, I don't think that it's ever going to be the case that they're able to totally eradicate them. But I do know we were helping a researcher at the University of Florida who's doing a broader research project on the on fire ants, and we were doing regular fire ant surveys to help him try and understand more about the fire ants. So
And then along those lines, so the fire ants will decimate little birds on the ground, and then if you're traipsing around the scrub, you probably have to watch out for them as well. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of doing field work in that environment besides the patience factor, and then I don't know if fire ants was part of it and what else you encountered while you're trying to help the sparrows and jays.
Yeah. Well, so just one interesting thing is that the fire ants actually aren't in Florida scrub at all. And nobody knows exactly why. There's an insect researcher at Archbold who thinks that it's because there's enough other established ant species that stop them from coming in. But for whatever reason, they're not in the scrub itself. So that is one of the nice things about working with the scrub jays over the grasshopper sparrows is I don't have to deal with fire ants. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's often, uh, being out in the Florida dry prairie with the grasshopper sparrows, it's hot. Like Florida is extremely hot. We're out in the sun and the heat and humidity for essentially the entire day. And our field work would end somewhere between 12 and 2 o'clock, which is the hottest part of the day. So I think that heat and sun exposure is the most definitely the most dangerous part of the job and the thing that is most likely to get someone in trouble. But there's also there's poisonous snakes. I would see water moccasins and very occasionally a rattlesnake. Although I would never go close to any snakes like that. I do enjoy seeing them. I think they're also a beautiful species. I In the Florida scrub, like all of the plants are really pokey and sharp and like hard to walk through. In part because it's what scientists call a xeric environment, so very dry. So the plants are really trying to protect and conserve all of the nutrients that they're able to collect. But there's lots of cactuses that grow in the scrub, and all of those oak species are very pokey and sharp and unpleasant to walk through. Um, yeah, so there's a ton of it's and and honestly, sometimes it's a total nightmare trying to like be out there in the sun with like ants and like thinking about snakes being everywhere. But most of the time it's really beautiful and pleasant, but there are some real challenges to being out there.
So we have time for a couple more questions, maybe like three more questions, and we have a couple unanswered. Charlene just commented that Citrus County has a wild population. I think she's talking about scrub jays in the Withlacoochee forest. And then
Mhm.
she also asked about the invasive boa snakes that you see in the Everglades and if you come across those.
Yeah. Um, there's the Audubon Society, the state, I don't know if chapter is the right word, but the state Audubon in Florida works with the Fish and Wildlife Commission to run a statewide program of jay volunteers, and those volunteers go out and monitor jays in areas like Withlacoochee. I met one of the volunteers who works at Withlacoochee just recently. It's a really great program. People from a pretty wide variety of backgrounds who are just interested. I mean, a lot of the folks aren't like Audubon volunteers or birders in particular. They just like nature and they like being outside. And they get training on how to count family groups and how to differentiate different family groups. And they go out regularly in their area to count the number of family groups that are present and how many helper jays there are and how many total jays there are. And I have never seen a boa constrictor. They're pretty range restricted to the Everglades, but I would venture to guess that climate change is gonna is gonna change that. So who knows? We may end up with boa constrictors in my backyard here. I hope not, but my wife and I actually this year decided to go camping in the Everglades for Christmas instead of spending time with our families, and I saw a crocodile down there for the first time in my life, which I'd never seen before. But I have yet to see a boa constrictor or any of the bigger invasive snakes in the Everglades.
So we have two more questions. What are the next steps to save the jays and sparrows? You talked a little bit about coming up with recommendations for ranchers. Can you talk a little bit beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I really honestly, that is probably the most important thing is trying to figure out how to successfully expand their range onto ranches. I, I the immediate next steps really are a lot more of the same kind of what sometimes feels like a daily grind of like trying to protect each nest and make sure that like as many of the young are able to survive as possible. And the captive breeding program is a really important part of trying to increase the wild population. Um, that day-to-day work is the heart and soul of what it's going to take to protect the species and to make sure that um, it is eventually delisted from being endangered. But with the grasshopper sparrow, there's just so few of them and so little habitat that, you know, we are going to have to figure out how they can coexist with ranches long term. I'm not working on that now. I don't know what all the exact steps involved in that are. Um, but that is going to be a multi-year process of trying to like figure out what the concrete steps that ranchers can take are because you know, I'm guessing most ranchers aren't going to go out personally and fence every grasshopper sparrow nest on their ranch. But it may be the case that planting certain kind of grasses or encouraging certain kind of growth or thinking about the rotation of their cattle may be things that could help them. With the scrub jays, the most important thing is continuing to conserve and expanding the land that's in conservation of Florida scrub. Without that, the population will continue to decline. Develop all of the scrub that's not under protection right now is constantly under threat of development, and it happens all the time where um, potential habitat is converted into development, and it's really hard, potentially impossible, for it to go back to being Florida scrub. There's actually one of the neighbors of Archbold. His father ran an orange grove, and he is in the process of trying to convert the one of the orange groves back into Florida scrub. Um, and Archbold is partnering with him as kind of an experiment to see how it can be done, because there's not many places where it has been done. But expanding the land that's protected and getting more landowners, public and private, to do controlled burns is the thing that is going to protect the Florida scrub jay.
Then we have one more question. Are prescribed burns part of the recovery project of the scrub jay?
Yes, absolutely. In some ways, it's the most important thing. Because even on land that's held in conservation, if it's not burnt with semi-regularly, then it will eventually stop being suitable habitat. So historically, there were regular fires in the area, and it's not actually known, in a lot of the prairie in Minnesota and other prairie states. There's been a lot of research done showing how Native people were a key part of running controlled burns, and a lot of people think about like a lot of the prairie habitat in Minnesota and the Dakotas and Iowa and so on as almost like giant giant gardens for buffalo that like native people maintain through burning. It's not known the extent to which the history of burns in Florida is the same. Florida is the lightning strike capital of the world. Even today, there's a lot of natural fires that are started by lightning. And presumably some percent of the fires historically in Florida were burns led by native people. But like I said, there's just less known about it here. Um, and there was like a regular natural fire regime in Florida scrub that maintained the habitat just naturally. And it wasn't until colonization and kind of Spain and then the United States coming into Florida and suppressing fire that we started to have the problem of the scrub stopping being suitable habitat for the jays. But yeah, prescribed fires are the single most important thing that a landowner can do to maintain or reopen scrub habitat for jays. There's a one site that we monitor called Carter Creek that about 20 years ago had two scrub jay families total, and today has almost 40. And the reason for that is that the Fish and Wildlife Commission started a plan of like systematically working through the entire property and doing controlled burns in it. And you can see the results just by the number of jays that live there now.
So it looks like we've run out of questions. I have one more. It's a bit lighthearted to end on. You mentioned coming across different kinds of snakes, and then I'm sure you're seeing many kinds of animals besides jays and sparrows. Can you talk about some of the cool creatures that you've been able to see in Florida since you started working down there, besides the two species you highlighted?
Yeah. And there's all Florida's a wild place. It's like there's all kinds of things that live down here. There's armadillos, which I see semi-regularly, and raccoons. But I'm like I'm a big birder. I really love birding. So we just had the Christmas bird count down here, and I was the compiler for that. And I just this last Saturday, me and a coworker actually did a Highlands County big day for birding. And we got what we think is the county's first record for broad-winged hawk. Um, and we saw a short-tailed hawk, which is a pretty rare hawk species, although it's regularly occurring in the area. But for me, it was a county bird. Um, and a out of season black-bellied plover. Usually black-bellied plovers are out on the coast. I really love all the bird species that I see, and there's a couple of pairs of great horned owls that live on Archbold Station that I see pretty regularly, and there's screech owls that live here. There's one wetland where I'm told there are king rails and Virginia rails, but I have yet to hear or see them. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty normal to like see alligators and out doing field work. So we see all kinds of interesting things.
Amazing. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our program, and I wanted to thank Stephen for attending and giving us this amazing presentation, the best presentation of 2025. And thank everyone for coming tonight. And Stephen, before everyone goes, if they want to learn more about these conservation efforts, besides the website, is there any other resources that you would guide them to, or like on socials or anything like that?
Archbold Station runs a really great Instagram page. We have a staff person who is just doing social media. So, the website really is pretty great. There's a lot of resources. There's an education tab that you can click on, and I think that there's going to be a PDF of that comic book put up on the website if it's not there already. Um, Archbold's YouTube page really is really very cool. There's a great short documentary about burrowing owls. Archbold, in addition to the station where I work, owns and runs a cattle ranch. That's a research institute, again, trying to look at like how ranches can be eco-friendly. So the documentary is about the burrowing owls on the ranch. So I, starting with the website, but if you're having trouble finding the YouTube page or Instagram, just look up Archbold Biological Station on YouTube or Instagram, and there's some really great stuff that gets shared on both of those places. The The Audubon, Florida Audubon is also really amazing. They just released a State of the Everglades report. I was looking at that today. So if you look up the Florida Audubon chapter, there's they also have some really great resources.
Excellent. Thank you. And then as a follow-up, we will post this program on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and watch any parts or share it with other people who you think would be interested, we will send out the link to the program once it's on our channel. And then once again, thank you so much, Stephen, for transporting us to a new ecosystem and introducing us to these amazing birds. And thank you so much for your work to help protect them.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Night.